Hey everyone, welcome to Pit Stops at Podium, the RevPartners podcast, where we talk to execs who have competed and won, taking their companies from high growth to high scale. My name is Brendan Tollison. I serve as the co-founder and CEO of RevPartners, and I'm delighted to have with me today Bill Schaninger for this episode of Pit Stops to Podium. Welcome, Bill.
Hey, thank you for inviting me.
Well, we're excited to have you. And so for folks that may not know who Bill is, I probably should say congratulations. Bill is now the senior partner emeritus at McKinsey & Company. So he has that distinction, but he's also an author. And so Bill recently launched a book called Power to the Middle. And I'm really excited to use this podcast to talk about that specific topic within the book. But before we do that, Bill, I think it'd be great for our audience just to get to know your experience and what you were doing at McKinsey. And congrats again for, I think you said retirement was about 7 or 8 days ago.
Yeah, May 31st. It's been a little bit of a whirlwind, really. I mean, it's nearly 23 years. I joined McKinsey August 1st of 2000 in London. And so it's been a long time. My McKinsey stretch, I think, significantly informed by what I had done beforehand. I mean, I'm talking to you now from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So the Lehigh Valley, very eastern part, Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton. I grew up here. Right. And my parents were teen parents. None of them went to school. I get up here and I just had, just kind of like, okay, hey, you can go to college, or by the way, you can go to college and wrestle and play football. And so my earliest years were, clever enough, but it really was just like, college was just this idea, this education, and okay, I'm going to go do it and continue playing sports, particularly wrestling. But when I was doing that, during that period of time, my dad had died when I was 20. He had just turned 40. And so it changed a little bit of the dynamic, notably on the finance front, which is I needed to start working. And so as soon as my athletic eligibility ran out, I started working at a place called Kids Peace here in the Lehigh Valley, which is a residential center for kids in crisis, residential, psychiatric treatment center. So when I graduated from Moravian, where I finished what was Moravian College, now Moravian University, they offered me a unit. And so as a 23-year-old, I was given this 22 to 25 bed unit with, 8 to 10 staff, a couple $1 million budget right in there, going, hey, here you go lead this thing. So everyone there was probably getting in the grad school, trying to get a master's degree in social work or in MAD in counseling or something like that. And we were all super passionate about what we were doing, but we had no idea what we were doing, in terms of the leading it part, right? This idea of how do you scale this thing that beyond just the passion and the purpose. Yeah. So I went back to school at night full time to get an MBA, and the parallels between what do you study, right? Strategic planning, marketing, operations planning, supply chain, things like that. There was always this thing where you build a plan, and there was a point where the plan ended and the people began. And funny enough, it very rarely worked out the way the plan was, right? Like, how do you get the people to do something different? So I started seeing these parallels between what I was doing during the day, which was explaining why the kids, the patients, were behaving the way they were. And at night, studying, well, why do employees behave the way they do? And that was like, hey, I actually really love this stuff, this explaining what happens when the plan ends and the people begin. Let's focus on that, just the human part of it. So I stopped working and went to Auburn for grad school, picked up a second master's and a PhD. And I thought I was going to be an academic, really. I was just, teach org behavior, teach HR, principles of management. Down at Auburn, I have a classroom named after my dad. It was my favorite classroom. It was the Mass Lecture Hall. Me and 415 of my closest friends, early on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And that was the earliest version of me figuring out how much I enjoyed large format engagement, speeches, a little bit of edutainment, things like that. And I only use that as a wind up because it started from the kernel of the human experience at work. And how do you actually get people who otherwise would be optimizing for themselves to optimize for part of the broader whole, right? What is the idea of the single noble purpose? What is this thing that makes, goes from a me to a we? And I was absolutely fascinated by that idea, this combination of behavioral economics, psychology, social psychology, sociology, all coming together in the form of org behavior. But I intended to be in the SEC and watch good football and write things that most people wouldn't read and not work very hard. That has not worked out. McKinsey was supposed to be a 2-year sojourn to London on someone else's dime, And so, so I joined in August. What was notable about that time, just in rounding out the story, we had about 5-6 months of the end of the dot-com era, crazy run up on talent, incredibly tight talent market, people throwing all kinds of options and salary at people. And then early 01, the bottom fell out.
Yeah.
So that was a really formative experience in terms of what happened when you went from these unbridled halcyon days to holy smokes, what's left.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I think it's like it's interesting in light of what you've experienced when you started McKinsey and probably what you're seeing now, even in the economy. Not to say it's the exact same parallels, but
very similar.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Every 10 years we have one of these, right? If you think about like when I first started paying attention to, say, management things like in 1990, we had sort of, remember 89 or 88, 89, we had the bad stock market.
Yep.
90, then just the run up through the end of analog, but the earliest part of dial up, right? So all the folks were like, you got mail, right? But that was like, I've got a 14.4 modem, I've got a 28.8, right? Or God forbid you had a 56.6. You were like, right, look how fast this is. Still largely analog, right? And so we had this weird run up, and then at the end of the decade, the real implosion on the .com stuff, also with Y2K, right? Two things fueling it at once. Then 2000 to 2008, you had that run, right? Before the financial crisis, and then the financial crisis to COVID. So roughly somewhere like 10-year tranches of almost always one or two fads, one or two, oh my God, analytics, oh my God, automation, oh my God, AI, right? And so we have these fads that we almost always overcorrect on. There's usually a commensurate response in financial capital and a commensurate response in human capital, right? And I think what we're seeing now is the human capital has shifted in a way way outside the bounds of what we're used to before, because the power dynamic is just so unbelievably different. Almost always, it's an asymmetric power distribution towards companies, and that is not the case right now.
Yeah, and it feels like it's almost happened overnight, to your point, of that dynamic. Well, let's before we get into some of the big idea, which gets into those topics when you were talking about kind of the process to people, also the meat of the we. Before we get into the meat of this podcast, which I'm really excited about, we do have a tradition here at Pit Stops at Podium, and that's to get to know our guests outside of work. And you're gracious enough to share a little bit more, like your origin story and where you grew up and some of those moments in your life. Maybe today, what does that look like for you? You're retired. How are you going to spend your time? You have family, hobbies. I doubt you still wrestle these days, but maybe you do. I know. I don't.
No. I gotta say, I go to the gym now with a trainer, and I try to remind myself, I used to be athletic. I was an athlete, and now it's like each movement, I'm like, oh, that hurts. I'm 53. I'll be 54 at the end of the summer. I think I still have a little bit in the tank to go do something else. But like closing in on 23 years at McKinsey, that was a good run.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful time there in terms of my good buddy and former colleague, Matt Guthridge, and I wrote the Organizational Health Index long, long ago. It's still being used, like 5,000 companies, 7 million people later. We came up with the influence model, and, we came up with the mass personalization and change and all this fun stuff, started people analytics, ran global talent. So that arc, not only was it fun from a McKinsey standpoint of really turning on a really cool way of thinking about people at work, right? Talent, culture change, structure, transformation, et cetera. It also laid the foundation for a really nice and rich set of colleagues and former colleagues and clients that now I could say, hey, Schaninger Services LLC is there. Maybe I'll just, I'll serve a small number of people privately, not with any big need to have a big program, just classic advisory and counseling. And most importantly, I don't have to give speeches away anymore. I will tell you, I love doing speeches. The idea of being paid to do speeches is pretty attractive.
So. I'm sure it is. And you mentioned Auburn. I'm in SEC territory, and I'm recording it from Atlanta, and I'm a Georgia Bulldog, so you're going to have to forgive me.
Hey, I'm an Eagles fan, buddy. We love the Bulldogs.
Oh gosh, yeah.
That is the bulk of our defense, man.
Yeah, exactly. It is. I heard it called the Philadelphia Bulldogs recently, which so I now. It's hard to be a Falcons fan, but if I'm not rooting for the Falcons, I'll be rooting for the Eagles going forward.
Well, it's all Bulldogs, which is wonderful, and I'm not sure about your quarterback situation. We'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, it is a question mark, but a lot of dog fans are hopeful that. Anyways, I will not get into college football because you and I are probably the only ones that care about this with our community. But I could talk a whole podcast about it. Well, Bill, let's transition into the topic that our audience actually does care about, which is not SEC football. And that you kind of tease out a little bit, but I really want to focus on the book that you're launching, The Power of the Middle. And a lot of it kind of talks through reimagining the role of the manager. And so I'd love to start here with kind of what drove you to write this book? What are the trends that you're seeing in the market that say, hey, this is a really important topic that as companies are scaling, they really need to place a heavy emphasis on the manager?
I mean, I had initially wanted to write a history book, and it was intended to be sort of those three eras I was talking about, 90 to .com bust, Y2K and .com bust, then that to the financial crisis to COVID. And part of the reason I wanted to do that was an answering of how did we get here? We're closing in on about 25 years since War for Talent was written and published. And yet we find ourselves in a situation where at any given time, 40% of employees are saying they're thinking about or going to leave. Many of those same 40% have already done it once or twice. A huge number of them, 2/3 or more, are saying they'll do it without a job in hand. I mean, we have a workforce that is questioning what's the point of a workplace. We have a workforce that has been hired in the last 2 years and not been properly onboarded. We have a workforce that resembles vendors and gig employees far more than classic traditional employees. So I think we've kind of, we've backed our way almost into a gig economy without even maybe being thoughtful about it. And so the reason I wanted to write the history book was saying, well, what got us here? And, we're McKinsey, right? I'm McKinsey for nearly 23 years. So I structure things to go, hey, there's a tranche here on the work. A lot of work has in fact changed, whether it was we were doing analytics before, then we were doing robotic processing, then we started looking at automation. Now it's in the application of generative AI. In all cases, the amount of really dramatic change we've had to work in the last 5 years, but particularly the last 2, amazing. I mean, who would have guessed that big box retailers would become forward deployed logistics locations? Because what do you do when you sell things and customers can't actually come in your store? You got to do something with it, right? I mean, the advent of kiosks in fast foods and apps where like you're actually not going in and not really interacting with a human. All those sorts of things, right? Even something as simple as if you go to a fancy restaurant, is there going to be a sommelier or are you going to be handed an iPad? Right? So both service and manufacturing. I'm bringing that up because the amount of tumult and change in work and questioning what's going to go back to how it was versus what is how it's going to be going forward. You have to have your head around that because literally the kernel of everything talent related starts with the work. What work needs to be done? Okay, well, who's best suited to that? Usually the direct manager, and someone in a people leadership role. To be able to go from that and then say, well, what does that mean for the workforce? What kind of skills do we need? You need someone capable of saying, what were we asking? Do they have to have a degree or not have a degree? If you're working in insurance and you're trying to do some basic underwriting, do you need to be an actuary? Or could you be an FP&A person who's pretty good at building predictive regression models?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that kind of stuff. Okay, who's best at that? Who's best at really knowing what's critical and what's determinant, and then pair that with some good people analytics? Should be the manager, right? The direct manager. And you get to this idea of the workplace. You go, well, what is the point of a workplace anymore? We think about what work's being done, how it's being done, when it's being done, with whom is it being done, and then lastly, where is it being done? Those questions around stuff that we used to just take as rote. Of course, we're going to eat traffic. You're talking about Atlanta, right? Of course, I'm going to eat 400. Of course, I'm going to eat 85, 75. Of course, it's going to take me 45 minutes to go 3 miles to turn off there at 10 and 14, right? Whatever. What if you don't have to do that? What's the point, right? And so again, okay, who makes the workplace something special? Well, people go, well, of course there's a purpose for going in there. The middle manager. But so the good news was we had an answer to all those, the middle manager. The bad part was they're also the problem. Because over the course of 30 years, it's a group that went through re-engineering and overuse and zealous use of Lean and Six or Lean Six, then the holacracy, then the humanocracy, then the self-serve, then the pushing of administrivia down to the frontline leader, then E-HR, then the abandonment of performance management, then the return of performance management, the hyperfixation on A players, the ignoring of the B players who deliver the business. All those things have gone on over time, all while having spans increasingly jacked and flattened. And in many cases, managers still being asked to carry their own tools and do work. That's a long windup just to say, at the moment when we need them the most to figure out changes in workforce and workplace, we've hammered them and we've not set them up for success. I mean, how many of the middle managers that you see today were really just incredible individual contributors? And then we had to be able to pay them more, so we had to call them a manager.
Yeah.
So that to me, the underlying impetus was, we need this group so much, and they're so important because we know that people leave bosses. They don't leave companies, right? The most important relationship at work is the boss. A massive determinant of life satisfaction is the quality of relationship with your direct supervisor. Amazingly important role with a group and a skill pool broadly unloved and undermined. And so that was the genesis of it, right? And just coming up from a perfect timing standpoint, just as we started seeing companies return to, hey, we got to go take some cost out. Let's go hit the middle. I mean, even now I see it on my LinkedIn feed. If you go look, there's still a group that's kind of recalcitrant, and we'll put out things about the book coming about. Well, middle managers are useless. I just beg to differ. I'm sorry. People don't arrive at a company knowing magically how it works. Most people show up wanting feedback, wanting coaching. Could you imagine sending your child to piano lessons and the piano teacher never talking to them? Of course not. Right. Would you go to a sports game where no one keeps score? The coach doesn't actually talk to the quarterback? Of course not. Why would we accept that at work? And so I think we're getting it wrong, just completely getting it wrong.
Yeah, there's definitely a trend towards that, to your point. And let's unpack a little bit of what you just described in terms of the justification for that middle management. And one of the things you talked about was that attrition that people are starting to see. I can't remember the stat that you used, but it was a large percentage that are leaving even though they don't have
2/3 of those leaving. 2/3 of them don't have a job in hand,
which is wild. And you mentioned, hey,
stubbornly stuck at that, Brenda. That's the amazing part. Like we thought maybe it was a spike early on when it was like a crazy tight labor market, but now that people are doing it, it's just there. It's like the steady state, which is, hey, I'll figure it out.
So I love to start there in terms of when we talk about the justification or the role of the middle manager. One of the things that you talk a lot about is as there's this war on talent, as there's more of this transactional layer, the middle management can actually thwart that or be a way to actually drive higher retention rates. So let's talk about that topic a little bit further in terms of how management can support people retention. Whether it's actually, let's do two things: recruiting and retaining.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the most amazing things is that so much of what we do requires the middle manager to be the sharp end of the spear. Whether it's, let's just say, something as simple as the purpose of an organization. How do you distill the purpose of an organization? Why this work should matter at all, and what it means to an individual employee? Well, that doesn't come in a written document. That comes from a conversation, an understanding of what matters to that person. Right? You need a human to do that. There is no large language model that's going to spit that out for you and have it resonate. Yes, it can produce something. That's not the same as talking to this person who's sense making for you. Right? And so that the basic things that matter so much. How about when somebody's job has changed and you be able to pull the job apart and go, those three, we're not going to do it all anymore. That's silly. Those two we can do with automation. Let's put this back together and figure out what's left for you, the human. Again, the person supervising the work does that in conjunction with the employee. So, I think when we look at these amazing things that the managers could be doing. And then before the book, we went to 800 or 1,000 managers and said, what do you spend your time on? What would be a really good use of your time, and what are you rewarded for? And what they spend their time on was not time on talent, planning, administrivia, meetings. They spent their time on that. Where do they think they should be spending their time? Sure, still a little bit of planning, but a 1A was time on talent, and then a long way to the other stuff, right? And what were they rewarded for? Planning, administrivia. Time on talent was not something they were being rewarded for, directed to do, or encouraged to do. And so we've built this machine where the managers are there to feed the beast, not feed and nurture the employees. So, if you were to say, well, what can organizations do to make this likely? The first one is just clean up the role. Change the jobs to be done. Go back and look at what are you actually asking them to do. I mean, I had a client who ran a really big refinery down near New Orleans, and they were having problems with their equipment breaking, and part of that was because they weren't fixing it properly. And we said, hey, we're gonna have the team out at first starts, which is like a 6 a.m. meeting. First maintenance crews go out to fix things. Do you want to join us? Might be really useful to get a handle on what's going on and what they think matters, and you can give them some broader context. No, I can't do that. I have a meeting with Houston. What do you mean? Well, it's a standing meeting. Note to self, right? It's like, what matters more to you than this refinery making gas? And this refinery only makes gas when it's running. So maybe we should be focused on that. But over time, you've just creeped in and made administrivia and rules and by rote meetings more important than nurturing and taking care of the human capital. So that was, that's first off, I think it's clean up the role. I do think, I think it's pretty important that you remind them and all the employees what good looks like. The employees who've not been onboarded right or never known any different wouldn't know what good is, right? But they're probably pretty clear about what bad is, and they're probably, in some cases, making excuses for it. I think if you make it incredibly transparent to both the people you're putting in these leadership roles, here's the expectation. You are going to talk with everybody every day. You are going to have feedback every other week. You are going to keep track of that so that at the end of the year, the form is not something new and a surprise to anyone. It's merely a summation and synthesis of what you've been talking about all year. If you were that explicit with leaders about this is your job, job one is leading, not administering, that might be a huge difference, but you go a step further and make it clear to the employees what you should expect. Right. And I think maybe, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Then I think, after that, then I think, look, I think this is one of those deals where there's a mindset here about if you're going to wear the badge, you got to bleed it. Otherwise, you shouldn't get to wear it. I mean, there's such an importance on these roles of being like, I work for, just think about people talking about work. They'll go about 10 seconds before they mention their boss. It is critical, right, that these people are the kind of people who are proud to wear the badge. I used to stand outside of refineries and chemical plants, and I'd watch these people go to their cars or went to a place to go get something to eat. And I see how many people take their swag off. Are they taking the jacket off? Are they taking the badge off? Things that will identify them versus the people who are like proud to be doing it, right? I mean, you'd see people like at Tennessee Valley Authority who were third and fourth generation and proud to have, that kind of stuff, right? The idea that the people you're leading are part of like your broader family.
Yeah.
Big deal from a motivation standpoint. But when you're really just there collecting the check because you're an individual contributor and or don't like it, it's a different level of emotional attachment and obligation.
Yeah. And I think to your point, it's a way to have that competitive, especially in this market, to have a competitive advantage where you have that loyalty, which is really, really hard to find right now. And I like what you were just talking about in terms of the role of the manager as it relates to rule enforcement versus challenging. I think a lot of what we talk to our team about is really middle management. You're carrying and casting the vision, the mission, and the values. And so it's so critical that they feel empowered, that they are not a taskmaster, but they're ultimately saying, hey, I own this culture and I need to make sure that I am contributing to it and I'm protecting it and I'm preserving it, and not just to enforce it, but to say, hey, how can this be better? Because oftentimes, to your point, it's more that taskmaster that I think a lot of people view with that management layer.
I mean, we talk a lot about the idea of the permafrost or the clay layer in the middle. And in many cases, it's talked about like whether in culture work or in communication. Like, why is it that the perfectly crafted email that the senior leaders think are going to like magically communicate once to everyone? Well, what happens to it? Well, in many cases, it's filtered through people who are disgruntled, feel unloved, feel disenfranchised, and they feel no compunction at all to sell your story. So you're lucky if they even acknowledge it. In many cases, it doesn't even get open. Shocking statistic when you go and look and say how many emails that ostensibly are said to have come from the CEO are actually opened. Even then, are they read, right? And so one of the things that's interesting as our technology has gotten better and the transaction cost of communication has gone dramatically lower, we flood the channel. And so now it's just noise. So you need a sense maker localized where you have no chance at all of bringing it to life. Whereas back in the day, when you didn't have that, you'd have like the office manager or the local leader, convening a bit of an all hands, right? And conveying, hey, here's what this means, here's what's coming, here's what it means for us. And then the lower level leaders would say, okay, here's what it means for you. That was authentic engagement in a cascading fashion, as opposed to now it's left to the beauty of an FAQ page and an email. And so we've lost our way with the importance of connecting the dots on the human level, not just allowing it. It's on the webpage. Why don't you go find it?
Well, I think that also speaks to there's a high. It seems like there's a high level of distrust.
For sure.
And so you have, like, to your point, it's really noisy, the white noise of all these communication channels. But even take at a core level, do I believe that leader, or is this just going to be, not only is it a ton of communication, but it's a bunch of garbage is probably too strong a word, but
well, I think you're close to it. If you think about the level of cynicism and the level of mistrust, I mean, it is interesting when you look across generations. So I'm 53. So I graduated high school in 1987. Well, what was happening then? The absolute destruction of cradle to grave employment was happening during that time. We watched our parents get fired. Right? Bethlehem Steel went cold. Mack Trucks moved away. Lucent went out of business within a few years. Just where I live, Fuller Company was bought. A good portion of that was you thought that if you went somewhere and you had a middle manager job at one of these big companies, that was an esteemed position. Oh, they're a VP at Air Products. They're a VP at PPL. Then within 10, 15 years, they became the source of Dilbert cartoons and TPS reports and who moved my stapler and jokes. Well, how did that happen? You went from something of these custodial roles that could really bring it to life for people and make work more than drudgery. Now they were the joke. And so, in that arc, I think you started seeing it became less about a wonderful part, the marrow of the organization, and a way station to get through and out of as quickly as possible. So you started seeing it used as a parking ground for people who were individual contributors and you need to pay more money to, or for people who did have talent, get passed through incredibly quickly, right? And you just create the next tool. So, I mean, so much of this has been both a structural as well as a talent system or talent strategy failure in just many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're arguing for is really the middle management becomes the most valuable asset for the organization, and it creates.
Well, from a scale standpoint, right? Shouldn't it be? Yeah. If you just look at the math, right? I mean, as a skill pool, they are a flywheel in and of themselves, just because of the sheer number of people. I know after years of increasing spans, they literally have more nodes coming into them than anyone else.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, that last point too, is like it kind of, you talk about the badge for the organization, like that you work at that organization, it almost becomes a badge for that role, that you empower that individual. That's not just a stepping stone to, hey, if you're an IC, to become a manager, or from manager then become an executive. It's saying, no, that, like, let's champion this persona because how valuable this is, and there are other ways to reward that behavior or their value, not necessarily through getting into another position, but really there are different ways to monetize it, to your point.
When I was a kid and we were playing football in junior high football, we had a guy who had coached in high school. I think he even coached in college a little bit. It's later in his career, in his life, and he just wanted to teach young guys the basics of football. A very, very early middle manager kind of role, right? And this guy was invaluable. The worst thing ever would have been pulling this guy out and putting him as like an assistant with the high school. Because if you were really looking at a feeder program, when you were teaching the 13-year-old how to get in their stance, how to really hit safely, how to really play the game and understand it, you needed someone exceptional at these skills. And, all around, you see anywhere where an organization, whether it's a team or a school or a company, that relies on a funnel of homegrown talent, because you can't possibly hire in everything from the outside. Those people down in the lower middle who really form and identify talent early and, there's something special here and let's groom it and let's have a chance of having a way that we do it as opposed to me, you rely on them so much. And when you don't have it, what do you got? You got one of these deals where you're learning a new playbook every year, and like it's going back to the football metaphor. And so I just think to the extent to which there's a way we do it, have people who are leading consistent in the way that we do it.
Well, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think there's that, pushes back on, I think, to a lot of, I don't want to say desire, but there's a desire for autonomy, and a desire to kind of have my own little kingdom. And I think this just pushes back on that concept of the value of the human, to your point, the human relationship and the role that that serves to go from that me to we and ultimately allow a company to scale.
For sure.
Bill, I mean, I look, I could listen to you talk all day, and I can see why you wanted to be.
I'm here to. You just made a really important point right there.
Okay, yeah, please do.
I want to do it my way. If you're going to be part of something larger, then something has to be suborned, and it's normally your desire and your will to do it your way. It is not artisanal when it's part of something bigger. If you want to do it your way, then become a vendor. If you want to lead your way, start your own company. But so long as you're taking someone else's financial capital and human capital and going to be a steward of them, steward them in the way of the thing. That's what part of it is. The reason we seek membership in bigger things is we like the protection. We like the stability. We like the comfort. Well, the give and the get on that, on the other side, is you sign up for their playbook, not your own. And I think somewhere along the line, we've made it a bad thing to say there is a give and a get. All exchange relationships, particularly social exchange, have a give and a get. And part of membership is your membership in something bigger than you. Yeah. And I think we've lost our way on that a little bit.
I love that. We had Horst Schulze, who was the CEO of the Ritz-Carlton for a long time. And one of the things he's got his content's great.
Absolutely right. Wonderful.
And one of the things he talks about, which speaks to what you're just describing, is, the number one factor for employee satisfaction is not your paycheck. It's the idea of
not
purpose.
Even close. Not even close.
And it's being invited into something that's bigger than yourself. And that's exactly what you're describing. So I wholeheartedly agree. And something we talked about.
I'm sure whatever was said on that one is gold. I'll tell you that idea of ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
It's the stuff that scions are made of. It's so wonderful. I used to regularly host events at Ritz's, and I would randomly call over a person from the catering team in the middle of the event and go, "What principle did you talk about this morning? Did you go over who's the house?" And they nailed it every time unprompted because they got it.
What a great example of a large organization with a vision and a mission, and all the way down at each hotel. To your point, they knew it. And so that crystallization just speaks to the value of having that continuity. But I'm sure there's that middle manager, whoever's at that hotel, ensuring that's getting
that program for general managers and the person who runs the front of the house, the person who runs the back of the house. That program gets it. In distributed assets, when you have locations or refineries or manufacturing sites, there is nothing more important to you to keep the cohesion of the thing than those leaders. How they're picked, how they're grown, how they're appraised, all of it, nothing more important.
Well, Bill, as we wrap up, final lap question. If our audience wants to learn more from you, how can they get access to the book or reach out to you for, let's say, a speaking engagement? So what's the next step?
Okay, so then I have a website being built and the LLC is formed. In the meantime, easiest way to get me is LinkedIn. It's under Bill Schaninger, SCHANINGER. And my email is bill.schaninger@gmail.com. And I respond to most everything, right? Anybody who's interested in this stuff, I love talking about. I think it is the calling of our time is to not allow these roles to go mired anymore, right? I think we need it more now maybe than ever.
I agree. It's super time sensitive. And to your point, it's been, I don't want to say polarizing, but I think there is that people are leaning towards the opposite side. So it's fun to hear somebody advocate for the other end with, the historical information, but also just evidence of how this can be such a powerful tool for companies as they scale. So, Bill, I really do appreciate you coming on board. I really enjoyed it. I know our audience will as well. So thanks so much for the time. We'll stay in touch.
We appreciate the time. Thank you.